Hey. I believe we got episode 18 going here.
Yes,
Paul
sir.
again, Rob, we're thankful that you're back. And we also are not insensitive to the fact that, Paul, we've had a couple of episodes that we got ahead of ourselves, right?
I know, man. We just got on a tear.
We got on a tear, and we want to respect. Well, we obviously want to respect our time and each other's time, but respect the time of the audience too. And maybe you got into it as well, because we have when we get, like, we're like anyone, we get on a tangent or a topic that's really something we love and are passionate about, and we just go.
Absolutely.
And Zoom is recording the whole time, but we've been okay. So um, this episode 4 of the hero kind of series within the.
Yeah, it's 4 or 5. Yeah, we're still in antiheroes at this point.
Right. And so both important to note, Paul's background, philosophy, theology, mine's political science, history, public policy, not math. So we may have lost count, but it's at least 4 or 5. And of course we've been in and honestly, some of these lasted so long they could have counted twice. So, but we are in the anti-hero. So we've moved from the virtuous hero who pursues the common good,
Yep.
defends the common good.
That kind of paragon of virtue.
Yes, paragon of virtue, and does it what we would consider the right way. And ends justify the means has never crossed through the lips of the virtuous hero.
Right.
Dark hero is a total Machiavellian ends justify the means to a certain extent. And so just to clarify, Superman, your best example of the virtuous hero. Dark hero, Batman, who definitely adheres to this. I'm here for the common good. I'm here for Gotham. I'm here for the people. But
if I crush a few windpipes on the way, it's okay.
I have to crush a few windpipes to get there. I may have to break some laws, frankly.
Yeah.
Because really, you can argue that everything Batman does is breaking the law, because
absolutely. I mean, he's vigilante, so
he's not a. They keep calling him detective, but he's not. He didn't get a badge, so he does work in cahoots with the Commissioner Gordon, and Commissioner Gordon has a light. But so there's kind of this tacit endorsement. But if someone wanted to get a wild hair, they could. They could kind of like Civil War and the Marvel movie. They could say, you need to stop doing that. So those are both fascinating, obviously. And we've talked about. You've walked us through the comic book,
right,
and how the hero is transformed through that. And then I've taken the leash for the anti-hero.
Yes,
that's very when most people think anti-hero, and this is not the origin of the anti-hero by any stretch, or the end game of the anti-hero by any stretch, but spaghetti westerns tend to become the prominent source material, modern source material for that builds upon the history of the ancient history and the more medieval history of the anti-hero.
Yeah.
And probably has and really there's and it's called spaghetti western because the movie, here's just so everyone knows, directed by Italian directors, but filmed in Spain. They were not filmed in Italy. Most of them were filmed in Spain. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was filmed in Spain. The famous cemetery scene was in fact, that cemetery is still around. It's in Seville, Spain. That's where they filmed Seville. Yeah. So, but they also build upon the history, the Italian history, right? And so the opera, all of that is there. And so we've kind of walked through, and I think one of the reasons we spent so much time was we did just as you did the deep dive with the comic books, I did the deep spaghetti western dive, tropes, trends, culture, and so, but we're going to get back on the direction now of connecting it spiritually, connecting it to biblical truth, to Christian truth, and I think today we're discussing the redemptive arc of the anti-hero and whether it's possible. And that's a nice little connection to our next phase. We're going to talk about the fallen hero and how redemption occurs. So I would want you, before I jump in, because I'm going to talk about how I see the overall spaghetti western redemptive arc and some examples, and then but I'd like to have you kind of work through a biblical model of redemption. Not that it has to be, a rubric or a 4-point plan.
Right.
What you're looking for. And I can tell you what I think we got.
Yeah, so I think it's important to specify that obviously we're talking about cultural narratives and we're talking about these hero stories.
Right.
And so the cultural narratives and the biblical narratives are not always, I mean, they don't line up, but there's something intrinsic to us as humanity that wants redemption. We like a redemptive story. You know, that's why we kind of always root for the underdog. We want him to come back and kind of seize the day. And so this idea of redemption, while it runs through cultural narratives, it mirrors in some ways the biblical narratives. So if we're talking about a biblical redemptive story, for those, of our listeners out there maybe who aren't truly as steeped in the Christian religion, we're talking about obviously mankind's fallen nature that comes all the way back in the garden with the first sins. God cannot abide sin in his presence because of his perfection. So he expelled man out of his presence, out of the garden. And God, in his loving kindness, covered over that sin, that those misgivings of mankind, that fallen nature, by creating the first sacrifice. And blood from the very beginning has always been a part of the redemptive process. There had to be some type of sacrifice included in that. And so years later, of course, in the ancient Old Testament days, we would consider that being the blood of goats or bulls. There had to be some type of atonement, as a big fancy word we use for, but some type of sacrifice that steps in and takes that punishment that God would have. Well, fast forward to the New Testament. Of course, as Christians, we follow the ideology that Jesus was the perfect sacrifice, that being the Son of God and being a human and living a perfect life allowed him to be that sacrifice once and for all. There is no other need for anything else. His blood was sufficient. And so those who have accepted Christ and his offer of salvation, then through that are covered by that blood eternally, and therefore are redeemed from their sinful ways. They still commit sins because we're also human and fallen, but those sins are forgiven by that eternal sacrifice. And so the redemption arc then follows mankind, as through Adam and Eve, we take on this innate sin nature, and it's pervading throughout humanity. We are inherently broken. Our wills are broken. Something is flawed inside of us. Carried through the Old Testament to the arrival of the incarnation of Christ, through his death, burial, and resurrection, and triumph over sin and death. Those who follow him, those who accept him as Lord and Savior, those who bring him into their hearts, their life, their heart, as we say it, their life, through mental assent and through belief, take on then this righteousness that he provided.
Yeah, and just to kind of clarify something, there's, and this is, and I'm not, the extent of my theological experience is teaching Sunday school for like 6 months, but it is important to note, I think, that all of that occurs within the context of a covenantal relationship that we have. And it's sometimes hard for people to understand what a covenant means. And I'm not saying that I'm an expert in it, but it's people, when they usually say, if you ask most Christians, what is a covenant? They'll say, oh, it's a contract.
Yeah.
And there's
a difference.
There's a definite difference. A contract is limited in its scope, and it's limited in its time frame, and it establishes at best a legal relationship, whereas a covenant is a full-fledged relationship. And we have relationship with God, with the Trinity, if you want to if you want to take that approach. And so the covenant provides that. When we mess up, though, and it's not just whenever because we mess up every day, but at some point we can break that covenant relationship with God, and so we have to. The sacrifice is what is that atonement that brings us back into the covenantal relationship with God. Yep. And that's always exemplified in the Hebrew nation, and the many times they broke the covenant. Which was, by the way, this is where it gets a little odd. And again, but I think it's also fair to say that the covenantal relationship, the breaking of that was part of God's plan. And so that's why the redemptive arc is, some people see the redemption as, oh, well, God's going to be nice to me. Well, it's really part of the covenant, really, which is kind of odd. Like there is this intention that the Old Testament covenant ends up being at some point replaced by the New Testament covenant, and the breaking, and that requires the breaking of the covenant, so that people can understand why they don't need to be under the old covenant. So that's that's a critical note I thought I'd throw out there, or I think it's critical. But it's also important to note that the covenant was cultural. And we as Christians, and the ancient Christians, were not the only tribe or culture, if you will, that engaged in covenants. And usually a covenant would involve two or more parties, but there was this divine aspect to it, that God was involved. So there really was at least three parties. And they would have a sacrifice when they would form a covenantal bond, and split the animal in half and walk through it and say that this covenant is to the death. And so it shows that it's not just a contract where, okay, now you're finished paying. Mortgages feel like they're forever because they're 30 years, but you're like, okay, it'll end at some point, right?
Right.
Well, covenant's not. I mean, covenant is it's eternal, right?
Yeah. One way I like to describe covenants and contracts to my students is contracts are like, there's a bilateral sense of recompense. If one of us breaks the contract, like if Robert and I have a contract, and let's say I fault on that contract, Robert has a recompense to square the deal, whatever it is. And the same thing goes if he does the same way. It's a bilateral. But in a covenant, it's a unilateral. You expect certain things from me, but you're going to fulfill your end of the agreement regardless of whether I keep mine up. And that's the same way God does. And that's why we say marriage is a covenant. I mean, we to death do we part. It's not a contract, but this covenantal language is so important to the narrative of redemption, because it literally frames the whole Bible, the whole biblical narrative. You could actually literally say that the biblical narrative could be summed up in God's glorification of himself through the fall and redemption of mankind by the blood of his son, Jesus.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And and I think I'm glad you brought up the unilateral, because when I do the comparison in some of my classes as well, and I say that it's unilateral in nature, because when you and I enter a contract, at least in theory, we're both supposed to have a say in the structure of the contract. And obviously we both have a say in whether we want to enter the contract at all. And God, at least in theory, God does give us the option of entering into or not entering into the covenant. We just don't have a say in the conditions.
Right.
The relationship, the entering of that relationship is bilateral in nature, but the conditions, if you want to call them that, are unilateral, and that God says, here it is, take it or leave it. And so that's another important aspect of this. But part of that is this redemptive arc. So, okay, so that's our understanding of a biblical structure of redemption. And so spaghetti westerns. So there's usually, I break down and there's obviously, as I've mentioned in the previous episode, there are hundreds of spaghetti westerns, and there are some that are more overtly political. And by overtly political, I mean it's the politics of Italy in the 50s and 60s, which is not very, I don't want to say, it's not always necessarily anti-American, but it does critique American. Sometimes it critiques American, like policies and intervention, like in Central America in the day. So there is some old aspects to it that would be old to us now. But obviously there's this Marxist sentiment, for like frankly. And so you have that. But really what we're coming down to is, at some point, to achieve redemption, that means that you must have fallen. And so it depends on your definition of falling, because obviously when we talk about fallen from biblical nature, that means a loss of virtue.
Mm-hmm.
And so it depends on how you define the virtue of the anti-hero and the spaghetti, the spaghetti Western cowboy. What is their virtue? And as we've said, since the character's an anti-hero, that means a couple of things. One, at least initially, we see someone who's focused on their own ends, their own success, and is not concerned about the common good, and not concerned about saving others, and not concerned about society. And obviously, given that that worldview is less concerned about has no concern about doing things the right way, and probably not necessarily concerned about what is sin and what is not sin, and what should they do wrong. But invariably, these anti-heroes end up playing a significant role in helping people who can't help themselves. And sometimes it seems unintentional, but sometimes it's very intentional, and they do so at risk to their well-being, their livelihood, their lives at times. Yeah. And so you see that, and then that invariably leads to, again, this is not the fallen as we defined it, but we see, and we talked about Campbell's hero process, and one of the processes the hero experiences a trial and fails at that trial, and then has to pick himself back up. Well, you see that in the spaghetti western narrative, and you see, and there's a lot of things that the spaghetti western intentionally skips over with Campbell, but especially when it regards to the background of it. But you see, and usually the hero, and this is maybe more of a Corbucci, like Django, or perhaps the Great Silence, or a couple of other movies that he made, where the protagonist, the anti-hero, had some superhuman quality.
Yeah.
And then definitely you can see that in Leone movies as well, with Eastwood, with shooting people here and there and everywhere, just getting down 5 or 6 people at once without even moving his hands, it seemed like. So you seem to have that, but they at times they'll lose that skill, and so they have to operate on their own devices. And so that's where their guile, their intellect comes into play, and they figure out a way to make it happen. But also in doing that, they again put themselves in a situation where they're engaging in something, and by the way, obviously it means they kill a lot of guys, right? So part of the redemptive arc is that they're killing 5 to 10 people on average, and they enter this situation, and it's some situations, like I think of Fistful of Dollars, each with Cara Joe or Monco. He could have just stayed hidden, right? After he gets into, he escapes from the capture, after he had helped the lady and that family leave. They punish him for it. He escapes, and they can't find him. And so we're led to assume that they would not find him, although they might eventually. But he confronts them.
Yeah.
And takes out like the whole family. And we're left with, did he, and this is what I love movies where you're left with questions, and one of the questions you have is, did he really have to do that? There's these people, there's these peasants or what have you that he's friends with, but they're not, I don't know how long he's been friends with them, but he comes back and helps them.
Right.
And so you see in a lot of these movies that redemptive narrative where they defeat the people who defeated them, and usually it's the only reason that other group defeated them is because they're double digit of opposition, and they come back and do it. So that's typically the anti-hero redemptive arc, where it's victory over defeat, victory after defeat, ultimate victory, lost the battle, won the war. Mm-hmm. There's also paired with that some sort of societal or community significance, that they're making things better for everyone, even though we're led to believe that they don't care about that. But it's apparent that they do.
Yeah.
So
I think when you talk about this, like what I keep coming back to is, like think about old kaiju movie. You know what I mean by kaiju movies? Are the Japanese, like the monster movies, you know?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So they would release, so Godzilla's wrecking Tokyo, right?
Right.
Well, they would unleash Mothra or Rodan or one of these other, super monsters that's going to wreck Tokyo as well. But it's kind of like, in order to catch a monster, you need a monster. That's kind of how it seems like these spaghetti westerns kind of play on that idea. Obviously, is it the Comanche family? Is that their name? Who was the family that he shot up at the end of Fistful of Dollars? It was Rocky's family, or Rocco, whatever his name is. Rojos, yes. Yeah, so the Rojo family, I can't remember. The Rojo family.
Yeah, okay, the main Rojo.
Yeah, I forgot his name.
Yeah, but he's in a lot of movies. He was the bad guy in A Few Dollars More. He was the head,
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's when Eastwood puts on the steel to protect.
Yep.
Hard, Uncle. In the hard. And
yep. He goes for the heart. So, he knows that. But when he takes them out, obviously they're a much bigger threat to the cultural survival than Eastwood is. His character is Joe. And I mean, this drifter that comes in, drinks a lot, shoots some people. Yeah, he upsets the balance of society, but he's not nearly as dangerous as these guys. And so the rest of the town has to, use a monster to catch a monster, basically, let him run his course. And now his redemptive arc was he overall better for the town? Yes. He left some bodies in his wake. He spilled some blood along the way. But this seems to be, when we talk about the anti-hero, are we better off in the end? Maybe not. Don't ask me right now. Just ask me tomorrow. Are we better off in the end? And that's where the redemption seems to come in. When you look back, in reverse, are we better off than when we started? Yes. And that's really an interesting paradigm, because it seems to build really heavily on almost an emotional equity. Before we were terrified, we were miserable, we were, whatever, threatened. Now that's gone. Now, granted, we are having to rebuild Tokyo again, but we're better off. We're not in fear of our life.
And the other thing to remember is that's very critical, and a lot of people. This is very much a pivot from the American Western, but those families that end up getting destroyed, totally wiped out, and very much due to the Man with No Name's intervention.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's what happens. He's the variable that makes it all happen, right? He's the spark. We know that there's this undercurrent of corruption and control that these families have, and the region or the city or what have you. It's the the Baxters, the Rojos wipe out the Baxters, and then Monco on his own, Eastwood, he wipes them all out by the Rojos by himself. But they control. They are their order. They are order in that area. And one of the critiques that the spaghetti Western makes is to critique order and its sources, and to say that just because you have achieved order and at least presumed peace, the absence of chaos. Just because there's the absence of chaos doesn't mean that everything's good. And
absolutely.
In this case, a lot of the control is happening for illicit means, and they make it clear that the other people, the rest of the communities, they're not really thriving or flourishing under all this. And so there's a litany of threads that you could go, directions you could go with that. And then you could talk about government corruption, intervention. You could talk about who really is in charge and why are they in charge. I mean, you can even throw in the old Marxists. The state placate, keeps things status quo just to keep everyone happy. But that's kind of be the way that everyone's like, okay, well, we have order. It's kind of like you could even say like a serfdom economic.
Right.
All the little people, the big people protect the little people, and for whatever reason, that's the case. But the little people really aren't happy or thriving or flourishing. That being said, though, now we move to, and I think of this in biblical terms. I think about the Hebrews when Moses leads them, into the wilderness. Okay, they're no longer slaves. What could be bad about no longer being a slave? Well, now you have to make your own decisions, and that's the thing.
Yep.
That if we're going to have a sequel to the Fistful of Dollars, if that really is, how do the people respond now that they have that the sense of order is gone? Because Joe ain't, the man with the name, he's not sticking around.
Right.
The donkey gone, right? And he just moves from town to town, right? So it's kind of, and there's been several, Western tropes about the wanderer. Mm-hmm. Shane is a classic example. Guy just rolls into town. There's the ranchers who are trying to run off the sharecroppers. So he wants to use that land. The land is because land is everything, economic. Yep. Point. And so Shane saves the little guy. He gets shot. He rides on out. And so you're like, okay, now Shane. Of course, he's killed all the bad guys. So maybe they're free to do what they want. But there's just kind of I'm not here long term. And so the spaghetti western always builds on that wanderer. And so you always ask. And sometimes they don't answer it. And I kind of like that. Like, okay, why is this person wandering? And that brings me to my point with Campbell. Campbell has this. And they mentioned this, like I told you about the documentary I saw, how the hero is in a normal, ordinary life. And then a mentor comes in and says, you can do better. Mm-hmm. Okay. And here's how you can do better. But that doing better, and I think of like they don't talk about the Hobbit, they talk about things more ancient, but it's kind of the same thing. Gandalf comes and says, hey, you need to go do this and that because you can help, you can be a hero and your life can be this exciting life. And if you want to do it. And so that's where the hero goes. And then we see we see it from ground zero, this development. Antihero is just like, boom, you're popped right in.
Right.
You usually don't know what made them an antihero. And you have some, it depends on whether you believe the Dollars trilogy is truly a trilogy to help develop it. But again, there's things that, because chronologically, the good, the bad, and the ugly would be the first one, and we really don't see anything about. There's nothing about the origin story of Blondie, as he's called, or the man with no name, that tells us how he became what he became. So so that's the redemptive arc in some of my favorite spaghetti westerns, which is just, as we said, the anti-hero wanderer who is just going, who all we know about his life is he spends it wreaking havoc, but maybe for the good. Yeah. And seeing and quickly being able to spot, due to his intelligence, like whenever he sees a sheriff, and anyone who has a sense of authority, very 60s, right? Especially in Europe, but that this person is, is corrupt, and I can't trust this person, even though this is supposed to be someone who's in a position of trust, because they're corrupt. And a coward. They always paint the sheriff as a complete coward. Yeah.
Well, and there's a couple of things you said here that I think just for a few seconds bear a little expounding on. One of them, you said, and I think this is so important, how you were talking about good and chaos. Good and order don't always equate. That there can be order, the absence of chaos, but it not be a good situation. And how fitting that these are Italians coming out of World War II into that post-Cold War or that Cold War era, looking at everything we've been through like you said, Leone and Carmucci, they grew up in that fascist regime, right, where Mussolini rolls into town and establishes order under the fascist regime. But that really wasn't good overall for the Italian people. And so you can see the Italian cultural threads coming out of World War II, obviously in here. And, obviously they weren't anti-American, but they definitely weren't a fan of it. So I don't think maybe the American man with no name, Clint Eastwood, is kind of that, almost Teddy Roosevelt-esque, talk softly and carry a big 6-shooter kind of guy that just, comes in and uprights it. But it's interesting how that element was there. But I really think that you said, Robert, is probably one of the truest things. Good and order are not always equatable. I think back to obviously my world of comics, and I think with perfect example, Magneto in the X-Men comics. Magneto wants to create order. He believes that keeping humans and mutants separated and letting mutants, the superior race, rule over the humans would keep order and peace and make a new utopia. Right. But obviously his means of doing it are not what we would consider good. He's no problem killing or enslaving people. And so the X-Men in the comics act as this chaos element, but they're doing it for the sake of good. And that's such an interesting cultural dynamic that we think about. We often think order and goodness go together, but they really don't. Those two things are very disjointed.
I always ask my students in class, one of the first discussions we have, at least in 2301 American government, is which do you prefer, freedom or security? Mm-hmm. And so security is aligned with order, and the achievement of that security doesn't always come through virtuous means at all.
Absolutely.
And I think it's very critical to note and I'm glad you remembered that wisp of fascism that they dealt with in their lives, and how Corbucci basically said everything about all the villains that he had. He goes, I'm responding to the fascist. Mm-hmm. I think it's really interesting, though, that if that is the case, and of course both of them grew up in Rome, and so they had to deal with directly with Mussolini, and then the least Mussolini turns out to be, ineffective loser, and so the Nazis come in and basically take over, and they have to deal with the Nazis, and so they have to deal with this force, they have to deal with this order, they have to, this force, this order over everything, this control over everything, overall, over any other outcome, and so they respond to that. I do think it's kind of interesting to ask, though, and of course we're moving a little bit from the redemptive arc. Well, mm-hmm. no, we're still in it. Why did they identify or use this anti-hero as the antidote to that?
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to that idea of, send a maniac to catch a maniac. Right. I mean, if you're going to overcome something, you need something in theory that is more potent than the thing you're overcoming. Right. So, yeah, they've established a sense, the Rojos and the Baxters have created this sense of order in town, in that the town still goes and grows, or at least it's still operating, but it's completely under totalitarian rule between the two of them. And so what do you need? You need an agent of chaos that's even more, potent than this sense of order.
Right. And an agent of chaos, though, who's very intentional about that chaos, mm-hmm. is very intelligent in their deployment of chaos. And and of course sometimes when they get stuck and they lose their control, and as I mentioned, sometimes they lose that superhero power, if you want to, mm-hmm. power, like being able to shoot 10 people at once. Like there's one Django scene where he can shoot somebody in the back like that, and I would have nailed my head, but that's part of it. Like when it comes down to just basic, I'm just going to have to find a way out of this. Mm-hmm. It's that they're just smarter and craftier, and that they've thought 3 steps ahead. Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is a great example where, and I don't want to do spoiler alerts, but where Eastwood's character Blondie is always playing chess and always thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. Now that kind of fits into the other, and again, the genre spaghetti western is so large that there's several. And I know I don't want to, again, I think we're reaching like the 35-minute mark, so I don't want to stay too long. But a couple more like subcategories. That's the I don't know if you call it the benevolence subgenre, but the anti-hero actually stands for something good, and there's several like that, and there's also several where there is a benevolence to the anti-hero, but the anti-hero ultimately doesn't succeed. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's some very dark ones. The Great Silence is an example. There's the one, A Bullet for the General is a good one, where these radicals meet the kind of this anti-hero, this agent of chaos. And this is a big thing in the American Westerns. They have an anti-hero, and you never know if they was really good or bad, at least based on the plot. He ended up being bad because he was riding along with them, because he's the one who had the bullet for the general, who was their radical leader, the revolutionary leader. So he was trying to end the revolution. So The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is one where it kind of stays within that, the concept of they're all in it for themselves, because there's the $200,000 in gold that they're searching for, and that becomes the pursuit of the movie. And so you see some things that happen that separate the anti-hero from the other just flat out villains, but you never see, you never have any sense of community support digital energy, because it's just not really the point of the movie, because they're all out for gold. And so, and of course, that's really, it's just those three individuals who are there to enrich themselves. And so, but they do have different approaches to it. And the anti-hero does show, there's many episodes, there's many scenes, like there's one where he encounters a soldier who's dying, and he finds that whatever they pull over the thing that you see him wearing in the fistful.
The
poncho. Yeah, he finds poncho, puts it on the person. It looks like just a blanket. Then he dies, and then he puts the poncho on. And there's always this metaphysical theory that he inherits that soul of that soldier. But you see that that compassion. And so that's probably the redemptive arc of compassion. Now, the last one I want to throw out real quickly, because I'm running low on battery, is the vengeance narrative. And probably the most famous, and there's so many examples of this, but probably the most famous vengeance narrative is Once Upon a Time in the Old West, because that's Leone. And you get into battles over whether this is his masterpiece or if Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is his masterpiece. But Once Upon a Time in the Old West has Hank Fonda's the bad guy. Henry Fonda is, a villain to top all villains. You see that very early in the movie. Frank is his name. And he is working for a villainous business owner, and that represents because the business owner, I think I mentioned this, he needs land to build his railroad.
Yes. Yeah.
Instead of buying it from the settlers, he says, well, I'll just have Frank and his guys kill them all. And so that's kind of that's how the West was won. The rich just plundered and murdered. And so Charles Bronson, and Leone originally wanted Eastwood to do this movie, and Eastwood was like, yeah, I'm doing, I think he actually said, because Leone is kind of passive aggressively saying, we can do that. And he's like, but where are you going with this again? Because I'm famous in America. I don't need those anymore. And so Bronson is called Harmonica, because every time you see him, there's a harmonica sound, and he plays a harmonica, and he has some really, really cool scenes. But it turns out harmonica is in singular. You think he's there to just kind of help, do good and whatnot. It turns out, due to flashbacks, you see he has a singular pursuit of Frank, because Frank killed his brother, and he was there when Frank killed his brother. And the way he did it was very, obviously just vicious. Mm-hmm. And so his singular focus has been tracking and killing Frank since he was young. And okay, the movie's 50 years old, spoiler alert, but you probably expect this. He succeeds at some point. And here's the deal. and this is very biblical. What happens if someone is filled with vengeance and that vengeance is satisfied? You see a lot of examples in the American Westerns where they just, okay, great, now, I killed the guy who killed my dad or whatever, shot my family, well, I'm just going to go get married now. But, like this, that's over now. Now I'm just going to go to community college and get a job, whatever. That's, and there's, Leone makes it clear in the movie that Harmonica can never fully does not have a redemptive arc,
right,
in escaping or moving on from the vengeance,
right,
because now he's left. The only thing that is left is really an empty husk of a man.
Yeah,
his purpose for existence now, it's existential. Like, why am I here?
Yeah,
there is the fetching Claudia Cardinal, who is one of the few women in a Leone movie, and she's a very strong protagonist. And she obviously is, in love with Harmonica, but it becomes pretty clear that, obviously she also wants to have this, the life of a family life and have some, and another character says, you just, if that's what you want, he's going to ride in here and he's going to ride right out of town, because now he exists for one reason.
Yeah. It's almost like they're instruments of vengeance. They're not, like I said, they're loss of soul. I think about the Quick and the Dead as kind of a modern take on a spaghetti Western. And that's the same thing with Sharon Stone's character, Ellen. She is there specifically in the gunfight to kill Gene Hackman's character. Once it's done, she literally just rolls right out of town.
Right.
And what an interesting narrative aspect. You just have this instrument of chaos being inserted, upend everything, and then
just going and but then again, maybe there's a little final note as we end and we talk transition, but part of the narrative is things needed to be upended.
Yes.
Now, once upon a time, the Old West is kind of different because but that's the thing, we see civilization coming because the railroad's coming, cities are coming, towns are coming, and Leone's saying, okay, the way it got there was not the way it's portrayed in history, and also, again, we're not sure it's a good thing. So, but now that's just a quick redemptive arc for the anti-hero and what that looks like. From here, we're going to talk about the fallen hero and hop into some great biblical examples like David and discuss what that looks like. So that'll probably be more aligned with that would definitely be more aligned with what we consider to be the biblical narrative of redemption. So great stuff. And that'll be episode 19. So hop on over when you're ready. And we appreciate your listening to our endless bantering on anti-heroes and spaghetti Westerns.
See you over there.